week's Torah portion is one of the best. In Parashat Yitro, we receive the 10 Commandments. Of course, Moses received not only the 10 Commandments, but the entire Torah on Mount Sinai. We actually have a great deal more than 10 commandments in our tradition. In fact, there are 613 commandments found in the Torah. Mathematicians are always quick to note that the number 613 is a prime number. The 613 mitzvot comprise 248 thou shalts and 365 thou shalt nots. In other words, about 40% of the commandments are positive decrees, and about 60% are prohibitions forbidding one thing or the other. 248 actually is an interesting number in and of itself. If you look at the three digits, the 2, the 4, and the 8, 2 is 2 to the first power, 4 is 2 to the second power, and 8 is 2 cubed. So that's an interesting number. And in biblical times, it was believed that there were 248 body parts to the human being. And so the thought was that we should obey the commandments with our entire body. And the number 365, of course, reminds us of the days of the year. And that was thought to convey the notion that we should follow the commandments with our bodies every day of the year. The reality is that I went through all 613 commandments today, and a whole bunch of them do not apply to the year 2016, or 5776 if you prefer. There are certain commandments that only apply when there's a temple standing in Jerusalem. So after you deduct 23 commandments that pertain only to kings ruling in Jerusalem, and 27 commandments applying to agriculture and husbandry within the kingdom of Israel, and 33 commandments relating to the temple itself, 64 commandments regarding Kohens, Levites, and Nazarites, and the tithing system that supports them, and 102 commandments connected to animal sacrifices that we can't do today. Then the only thing left is the 10 Commandments. Actually, that's not true. We have a lot more, but by my count, about 60% of the commandments would be applicable today, and about 40%, or maybe 41%, are things that just don't pertain to a generation which we don't have a temple in Jerusalem. Now, some of the commandments, like the prohibition against wearing wool and linen at the same time, may not feel so relevant today, but you don't need a temple in Jerusalem to observe that one, so that's technically applicable. Other commandments, such as the prohibition against men wearing women's clothing and vice versa, may feel a little antiquated to our contemporary progressive mindset that we have today. Back in July, I delivered a sermon in which I showed a variety of different approaches that we can take to the commandments, including the power to choose which commandments we feel will bring more meaning into our lives, such as the commandment to provide for the needy who live amongst us. Tonight, however, I do want to focus on the 10 commandments that we received at Sinai. So let's just review them. The first one, according to the Jewish tradition, and it varies. There are different Christian numbering systems. In fact, there's different Jewish numbering systems, but the one that prevailed lists the first commandment as I am Adonai your God. It doesn't exactly command us anything, but it's the belief that God is the one and only God of all. The second one is that we're not supposed to have any other gods before Adonai, and we're not supposed to have graven images, so idols, that kind of thing. Third commandment, we can't take God's name in vain. The fourth is to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. The fifth one is to honor your father and your mother. Number 6, thou shalt not kill. Number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. Number 8, thou shalt not steal. Number 9, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. And lastly, thou shalt not covet. One of the more interesting approaches that I've seen is a discovery made by Abraham Barchia Hanassi, a Jewish mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher born in Barcelona in the year 1070, who made his way to Narbonne, France, where he passed in 1145. Abraham Barchia discovered that after the first commandment, the remaining commandments fit very nicely into this table that I passed out earlier. If you look at it closely, you can see that, unfortunately, for it to work, you have to flip numbers 8, 9, and 10. You can see those are in reverse order. But numbers 2, 5, and 10 going across, those are all commandments about what goes on in our minds. Numbers 3, 6, and 9 are speech actions. Okay, so thou shalt murder as a speech action is a little bit of a stretch, but work with me here. And numbers 4, 7, and 8 are commandments about doing things. So you have those themes that cut across the spreadsheet that we have here. And if you look vertically at the columns, then numbers 2, 3, and 4 are matters between man and God, or people and God, or humans and God. Numbers 5, 6, and 7 are amongst humans and our family. And numbers 10, 9, and 8 are between people and other people. So we have those interesting themes running through them. The one that gets a little tricky is the thou shalt not murder. That's hopefully not just applying to family members, but to anyone. So that's the one part that really doesn't work as well for Abraham Bar Chia's table. But I think it is kind of interesting just to see those themes generally running through certain commandments. What I find even more interesting is the fact that the Ten Commandments appear in the Torah not once, but 2 times. They appear in Exodus, and they appear in the book of Deuteronomy, and it's not exactly the same. So, for example, in the Exodus rendition, we're commanded, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house, and then it says, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife, in that order. That's Exodus 20:14. But in the Deuteronomy version, it flips the order. It says, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife, and thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house. So it flips the order in Deuteronomy 5:18. So what's the difference, right? What does it matter which order it is if we're still not supposed to covet either the wife or the house? Well, the difference is this: it's supposed to be the Word of God. The Torah is meant to be the Word of God. So what exactly did God say at Sinai? Was it the version that we find in Exodus, or was it the version that we find in Deuteronomy? The rabbis, as I mentioned earlier in the service, the rabbis tried to reconcile the two, and they came up with a midrash that said that God actually said both sets of the Ten Commandments simultaneously, that God was able to sort of speak in 2 voices, that God is so omnipotent, so all-powerful, that God had the power to speak simultaneously. But that still doesn't explain really why there would be 2 different versions. That might be a cool power to have, but it doesn't really explain the difference. And the meaning is essentially the same, but I think that what we see here actually is the role of human beings, which are imperfect, transcribing and transmitting the divine revelation. So the revelation itself could be perfect, but the people who pass it on, lador vador, from generation to generation, we're not perfect. And so through that transmission process, we see different variations in the text. Perhaps a more interesting difference between the Ten Commandments that we find in Exodus and those that we find in Deuteronomy is the commandment regarding Shabbat. Exodus tells us to remember Shabbat, Zachor. Deuteronomy tells us to observe Shabbat, Shamor. So when we sing Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad, when we sing L'chad Odi at the beginning of the service, we're actually quoting that midrash that I mentioned, claiming that God spoke both words with one mouth. Not that God has a mouth or any body for that matter, because we don't think of God as a corporeal being, let alone a human being. But at the end of the day, there isn't much of a semantic difference between remembering Shabbat and observing Shabbat, because we would observe that commandment essentially the same way either way. But in the Exodus version of the Ten Commandments, the reason for remembering Shabbat is very different than it is in the Deuteronomy version of the commandments. In Exodus, it very explicitly links Shabbat with creation. God rests on the 7th day, and we're meant to rest because God rests, and it reminds us of creation. It reminds us that God is the source of creation, right? But in the Deuteronomy version, actually, the reminder is not to the creation story. It's actually to the Exodus story, that God freed us from slavery. slavery. So when we were slaves, we had to work every single day of the week. But after we were freed and we were commanded to observe Shabbat, we had this rest day. So it's a very different reason for observing Shabbat that we find in both commandments, in the ones that are found in Exodus and the ones that are found in Deuteronomy. What I think we see here is more than simple differences in the human transmission of the Torah. What I believe we're looking at is an effort by the good men and maybe women who preserved our traditions to be inclusive rather than exclusive in the transmission process. If there were two traditions being passed down orally, lador vador, from generation to generation, then they chose to weave both traditions into the final Torah canon. This is something we see time and again throughout our tradition. Some traditions call God Elohim, others call God Adonai. Both are found in the Torah. In one version of the story of Noah, the animals board the ark 2 by 2, but there's another version also in the Torah in which we have 7 of each animal. They didn't teach you that in Sunday school, but that's also in the Torah if you read it closely enough. In our prayer books, we have one version of the Michamocha for the morning, and we have another version for when we do it in the evening. The more you look at Jewish tradition, you see these efforts to include various traditions. In fact, if you look at the Talmud and you study it, the more you study the Talmud, the more you realize that it's less of a legal treatise than it is really a compendium of the diversity of Jewish traditions, proudly displayed to show a variety of equally correct ways to interpret Jewish law. When some people study the Ten Commandments, as we do today, I think they may feel sometimes burdened by the yoke of Jewish tradition. Perhaps, however, we should be looking at the Ten Commandments as one of the most prominent displays of the fact that in Judaism, there's more than one way to be right. Shabbat Shalom.